On the 3rd of September 2018, in the final episode of Adventure Time, two characters who had circled each other for the better part of a decade finally shared a kiss. Princess Bubblegum and Marceline the Vampire Queen, in the middle of a war for the fate of the world, turned to each other and made the thing the show had only ever implied undeniably real. For millions of viewers, it was a quiet, joyful, long-awaited moment. And in a number of countries around the world, that moment never aired at all. The kiss was cut, edited out, removed before broadcast, because in some of the places where Adventure Time played, a kiss between two women was considered too suggestive for children. And in some of those places, it was not merely frowned upon, but illegal. That single moment, beloved in some countries and forbidden in others, is the perfect doorway into a subject most casual viewers never think about, which is that Adventure Time, for all its gentleness, for all its candy-colored whimsy and its reputation as a sweet bedtime sort of show, was quietly one of the more quietly contested cartoons of its era. Underneath the soft surface, the show was the site of a series of real disputes over what it was allowed to show, over who it was really for, over how dark a children's program could be, and over the slow, difficult country-by-country question of which kinds of love a cartoon could depict. These were not loud scandals. Adventure Time was never a tabloid show, but the controversies were real and documented, and they tell a story about the era it was made in. Tonight, we are going to go through them calmly and carefully. The documented controversies of Adventure Time, the censorship and the cuts and the debates and the behind-the-scenes pressures, told the way you would tell any piece of quiet history, without sensation, without outrage, simply as the record of what happened. Some of these controversies are about representation, some are about violence and content standards, some are about the strange position of a deeply mature show airing on a network for children, and one is about the toll the show took on the man who created it. None of them will keep you awake. All of them are true. Welcome to Pine Hat. Let's begin. The largest and longest-running controversy in the show's history is the one that ended with that kiss. And to understand the kiss, you have to go back to the beginning, to an episode in the 3rd season called What Was Missing. In that episode, the show first planted the suggestion, light and deniable, that Princess Bubblegum and Marceline shared a history more intimate than ordinary friendship. There were small details, a kept shirt, a charged tension, the suggestion of an old closeness gone wrong. None of it was stated. All of it was implied in the way the show implied so many things, leaving the surface innocent and the depth available to anyone looking. And audiences looked, and audiences noticed, and the subtext became a subject of conversation almost immediately. What happened next is documented and revealing. A recap of the episode posted to an official associated channel, a channel called Mathematical, was reportedly taken down, the kind of quiet removal that fans noticed and discussed. The implication many drew was that the network was not entirely comfortable with how clearly the queer subtext was being read, that the suggestion the show had planted was being treated, at the corporate level, as something to be managed rather than celebrated. The show had ventured to the edge of depicting a same-sex relationship. Audiences had immediately understood, and the response from above was caution. This was the early part of the decade, a different moment in television, and a children's network was navigating carefully and not always bravely, a subject that much of its audience was ready for, and some of its global markets were not. For years after that, the relationship between Bubblegum and Marceline existed in a deliberate ambiguity, present in every charged interaction. Confirmed nowhere. And then, in August of 2014, the situation was clarified from an unexpected direction. Olivia Olson, the actress who voices Marceline, stated publicly that the show's creator had told her the two characters had indeed dated in the past, but she also explained the constraint, the reason the show could not simply say so, and the reason is the heart of the whole controversy. The show aired, she explained, in areas of the world that discourage same-sex relationships, places where depicting such a relationship was not permitted, and so the show had not been able to officially clarify what its creator privately confirmed. The relationship was real in the minds of the people making the show. It simply could not be spoken aloud, because of where the show was allowed to play. This is a controversy without a villain, which is part of what makes it interesting. It was not a story of bad people suppressing good ones. It was a story of a show caught between a domestic audience increasingly ready for honest representation and a global distribution that included places where such representation was forbidden by law. The creators wanted to tell the truth about their characters. The economics and the legalities of international broadcast made it complicated, and the result was years of a relationship that everyone could see and no one was allowed to name. A quiet standoff between what the show meant and what the show could say, playing out in glances and implications across season after season. The standoff finally broke in the finale, with the kiss, and the kiss was both a triumph and the occasion for the controversy to flare one last time. In the countries where it aired uncut, it was celebrated as a landmark, the culmination of a relationship fans had followed for years, a rare and meaningful piece of representation in a mainstream children's cartoon. And in the countries where same-sex relationships are restricted or illegal, the kiss was simply removed, edited out of the broadcast, so that viewers in those places saw a finale with a quiet absence at its center, a moment that the rest of the world had seen and they had not. The same few seconds of animation were, depending on where you lived, either a celebrated milestone or a thing that officially never happened. And that split, that map of where a cartoon kiss was allowed to exist, is one of the more striking documents of its moment in television history. The cutting of the kiss was only the most prominent example of a much wider pattern, because Adventure Time was, throughout its run, a heavily edited show in many parts of the world, adjusted region by region to fit different standards of what children should see. The most sweeping example came in 2017, when the show was banned outright in Kenya, with authorities there objecting to content they characterized as promoting homosexuality. An entire country removed the show from the air, not over a single scene, but over the perceived nature of its content. A reminder that the disputes around Adventure Time were not always about individual moments, but sometimes about whether the show as a whole was permissible at all. Beyond outright bans, the show was subjected to a long list of smaller edits across different territories, and these edits, taken together, form a kind of map of the world's varying anxieties. The show was, by multiple accounts, heavily censored in the United Kingdom, and that censorship spread to other European broadcasts, including in Italy, Serbia, Spain, Poland, and Portugal. The specific changes are often small and almost comical in isolation, but they reveal what different broadcasters considered unacceptable. In one case, a line in which a character described popping someone's head like a cork was altered for an Australian broadcast. The offending word replaced with the chirping of a bird, so that the violent image was softened into nonsense. Music was edited too. A song from the show, a cheerful little number whose lyrics included a violent image about tearing off someone's arm, was reduced to an instrumental version in Australia. The words removed entirely so that the melody could play without the disturbing content. A recurring physical gag, in which Jake pinches Finn, was censored in reruns across several countries, including the United Kingdom, Australia, the Philippines, and Spain. A line in which a character bluntly told another that he now sucked was cut in at least one airing. None of these are large moments. The patient region-by-region adjustment of a children's cartoon to fit dozens of different thresholds of acceptability shows how much quiet negotiation surrounded the show's global life, how a single program became dozens of slightly different programs depending on where in the world you watched it. Some episodes ran into trouble not for a single line, but for their whole content. And the clearest example is an episode called Ghost Princess. This episode was refused for broadcast by Cartoon Network in Australia, and the reasons given touched on several of the network's anxieties at once: hints of murder, on-screen death, sexual themes, and supernatural content deemed unsuitable for the intended audience. An entire episode, in other words, was judged too dark to air in a particular market, set aside rather than edited, a piece of the show that some viewers in some countries simply never received as part of the ordinary run. Other episodes were shifted around, with some content relegated to Halloween specials or held back for being deemed too frightening or too violent for regular programming. What all of this reveals is that the gentle reputation Adventure Time enjoys in retrospect conceals how much friction it actually generated with the gatekeepers of children's television around the world. The show was constantly bumping against the edges of what was permitted in territory after territory, and the edits and bans and refusals were the record of those collisions. It is easy now to remember the show as soft and beloved and uncontroversial. The censorship history tells a different story, of a program that was, quietly and persistently, more than many broadcasters were entirely comfortable airing. A show whose darkness and frankness kept setting off the alarms of standards departments across the globe, and that had to be trimmed and adjusted and occasionally pulled to fit the varying ideas of what a cartoon was allowed to contain. And underneath all the specific edits lay a deeper tension that was, in its way, the root controversy from which the others grew: the question of who Adventure Time was actually for. Because the reason the show kept running into content standards was that it was, genuinely, a much darker and more mature program than its time slot and its candy-colored surface suggested. And that gap between what the show appeared to be and what it actually was generated a debate that followed it throughout its run and has never entirely been settled. The creator himself gave the tension its most memorable description. Pendleton Ward described Adventure Time as Candyland on the surface and dark underneath, and that phrase captures precisely the source of the debate. The show looked like a program for small children and contained material that spoke to a much older audience. And these two facts existed in permanent tension. The bright animation and the silly humor drew in young viewers, while the dark themes, the off-color jokes, and the genuine emotional and philosophical weight drew in teenagers and adults. The very thing that made it appropriate for one audience was the thing that made it questionable for the other, and the show never resolved this, because it never wanted to. It wanted to be both at once, and being both at once is exactly what made its place on a children's network a matter of ongoing debate. The substance of the concern was real. Over its run, Adventure Time engaged, in its cartoonish way, with subjects rarely found in programming aimed at children, with death and mortality treated seriously, with depictions and implications that touched on alcohol and substance abuse, with sexuality handled through innuendo and subtext, with mental illness and trauma rendered through characters like the Ice King. Much of this went over the heads of its youngest viewers, encoded in jokes and details they would not catch, but it was unmistakably there, and parents and critics noticed. Reviews aimed at parents, including from organizations that advise families on media, were divided, some judging the show suitable for children, and others cautioning that its darker themes and complex narratives made it more appropriate for older kids, or for viewing alongside an adult who could discuss what it raised. A crucial detail sharpened the debate, which is where the show actually aired. Adventure Time played during Cartoon Network's regular daytime and primetime programming, the blocks aimed at children rather than on Adult Swim. The network's late-night block explicitly intended for grown-up audiences. Had it aired on Adult Swim, much of the controversy would have evaporated, because the mature content would have matched the slot. But it did not. It aired in the children's hours with the children's branding, while containing material that a significant share of its actual audience was much older to appreciate. The mismatch between the content and the time slot was, in a sense, the structural cause of the whole long debate about appropriateness. A genuinely mature show wearing the schedule and the packaging of a show for the very young. Some parents pushed back. There are documented complaints from parents who felt the show was not appropriate for the young children it appeared to be marketed toward, who were surprised to find in a colorful cartoon their children loved, jokes and themes they considered too adult. These complaints were never a mass movement, and the show retained an enormous and devoted following across all ages. But they were part of the texture of the show's reception, the recurring note of concern from a portion of the parental audience who felt the candy surface had lured their children towards something darker than advertised. The show's defenders argued the opposite, that its honesty about difficult subjects was precisely its value, that children are capable of handling more than we assume, and that a show willing to treat death and loss and complexity seriously was doing young viewers a service rather than a disservice. This debate never reached a verdict, and in a sense, it was settled only by the passage of time and the creation of a successor. Years after the original series ended, the creators developed a spin-off following the characters Fiona and Cake, and they made a telling choice. They wrote it explicitly for an older audience, for the viewers who had grown up with the original show and were now adults themselves. The decision was an implicit acknowledgement of the very tension that had dogged the original, a recognition that the audience had always skewed older than the children's network framing suggested, and that the natural home for the show's sensibility was in fact a more mature one. The spin-off could be openly what the original had only been able to be by implication, and in that openness you can read the resolution of the old debate. The show had always been, underneath, for the people who were now finally old enough to be its acknowledged audience. The deeper significance of the appropriateness debate is what it revealed about a shift happening in animation itself during the show's run. Adventure Time was part of a wave of programs that expanded what a cartoon ostensibly for children could be, that brought genuine emotional seriousness, moral complexity, and mature themes into a form long dismissed as simple entertainment. The controversy about whether it was appropriate for children was viewed from a distance, really a controversy about whether the old boundaries of children's animation still held, and the show was on the leading edge of dissolving them. The discomfort it generated was the discomfort of a medium changing, of a form outgrowing its assumptions, and the debate about Adventure Time's appropriateness was, in the end, a small front in the much larger transformation of what animation was allowed to be. Not all of the controversies were about content. One of the most significant was about the people making the show, and specifically about the man who created it. In October of 2014, it emerged, through an interview Pendleton Ward gave to Rolling Stone, that he had quietly stepped down as the showrunner of Adventure Time. And the striking thing was the quiet of it. He had stepped back during the 5th season, but the change had not been announced, had not been made a public event, so that audiences and even much of the press only learned after the fact that the person most associated with the show was no longer running it. The creator of one of the most beloved cartoons of its generation had walked away from the helm, and for a while, almost no one outside the production knew. The reason Ward gave was not creative disagreement or a falling out, but something quieter and more human: burnout. He explained that the role of showrunner was negatively affecting his quality of life, and he was specific about what exactly had worn him down. It was not, he said, the part of the job that involved creating worlds and characters and stories, the imaginative work that had drawn him to animation in the first place. It was the other part, the management, the dealing with people every day, the endless requests and pressures that come with running a large production. Dealing with people every day, he said, wears on you, and the energy required to keep making something worth making, to keep it at the level it deserved, had become more than he could sustain in that role. The pressures had only grown as the show succeeded. As Adventure Time became a phenomenon, the demands multiplied, the merchandise and the games and the business of a hit franchise all expanding around it, adding to the weight on the person at the center. The very success that made the show beloved made running it harder, piling administrative and commercial burdens onto a creator whose gift was for the imaginative work, not the corporate machinery that success generates. It is a quietly common story in creative industries. The artist who builds something wonderful and then finds that the reward for building it is to be buried in the work of managing it, and Ward's decision to step back was, in that light, an act of self-preservation, a choice to protect the part of himself that had made the show possible in the first place. The transition itself was handled with care. Adam Muto, who had been a classmate of Ward's at the California Institute of the Arts and had worked on the show from early on as a storyboard artist, was trained to take over the showrunner role, ensuring continuity rather than rupture. And Ward did not vanish. He continued to work as a writer and storyboard artist on the show through the 6th season, and remained an executive producer all the way through to the series finale, staying connected to the work he loved while shedding the management he did not. The show continued under Muto's stewardship to be acclaimed, to reach its remarkable conclusion, which is itself a quiet testament to how the transition was managed. A change at the very top of a major production that produced no visible decline in quality. Whether this even counts as a controversy is a fair question, and the answer says something about the show. There was no scandal in Ward stepping down, no wrongdoing, no bitter dispute. Only a creator honestly admitting that a role was costing him too much and stepping into one that suited him better. The controversy, such as it was, lay mostly in the secrecy, in the fact that so significant a change had been kept quiet, leaving fans to feel, when they learned of it, that something important had happened behind a curtain they had not known was there. But even that was less a controversy than a poignancy, the revelation that the cheerful show they loved had been, behind the scenes, the source of real exhaustion for the person who dreamed it up. That making something that brings joy to millions can quietly wear out the one who makes it. There is something worth sitting with in that, especially for a show so preoccupied with the cost of things, with the prices its characters pay for their power and their gifts. The man who created a world about the hidden costs beneath bright surfaces turned out to be living his own version of that theme, paying a hidden cost beneath the bright surface of the show's success. He gave the world ooh, and giving it took something out of him. And he had the honesty to admit it and the wisdom to step back before it took more. It is the least sensational controversy in the show's history, and in some ways the most human, the quiet story of an artist who loved his creation and had to protect himself from the weight of running it. To understand why the Bubline controversy mattered so much, it helps to place the show in the larger history it was part of, the slow, contested arrival of honest representation in animation aimed at young audiences. When Adventure Time began in 2010, a clearly depicted same-sex relationship in a mainstream children's cartoon was effectively unheard of, something networks avoided, advertisers worried about, and international markets forbade. The medium had long operated under an unspoken rule that such relationships simply did not appear, were not depicted, were kept off screen. And the rule held not because audiences rejected them, but because the gatekeepers feared controversy, lost markets, and complaints. Adventure Time arrived into that landscape and slowly helped to change it. It did not change it alone, and the connections are worth noting. One of the show's own storyboard artists and songwriters, Rebecca Sugar, left Adventure Time and went on to create Steven Universe, a show that would push the depiction of queer relationships and identities in children's animation considerably further and more openly than Adventure Time itself ever could. The lineage is direct. The sensibility that found careful, deniable expression in Adventure Time found fuller voice in the show one of its alumni created next. And together, these programs, and others alongside them, formed a wave that transformed what animation aimed at young people was willing and able to depict. The controversy around Bubline was, in this light, not an isolated dispute, but one battle in a larger shift, a single front in the broader opening up of the medium. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The progression within Adventure Time itself maps this shift in miniature. In the early seasons, the relationship could only be subtext, deniable, a thing of glances and implications, present to anyone looking but officially absent. By the time of the finale, 8 years later, the culture had shifted enough, and the show had earned enough standing, that the kiss could finally be shown, at least in the markets that permitted it. The distance between the deniable subtext of the third season and the explicit kiss of the finale is the distance the whole medium traveled in those years, and the show traveled it in real time, constrained at first, freer at the end. Its own evolving frankness a record of a changing world. The controversy was, in a sense, the friction of that change, the resistance the show met as it pushed against an old boundary that was, slowly, giving way. And yet the international cuts to the finale kiss are a sobering reminder that the change was and is uneven. In much of the world, the kiss aired and was celebrated. In other parts, it was removed, and in at least one country the entire show had already been banned over its perceived content. Representation that felt like a hard-won triumph in some places remained forbidden in others, and the same few seconds of animation that marked progress in one market marked the limits of progress in another. The controversy did not end with a clean victory. It ended with a map, a divided world in which a cartoon's depiction of love was a milestone here and a crime there. And that division is part of the honest record of what the show's representation actually meant, celebrated and censored at the very same moment, depending entirely on where the screen happened to be. This is why the Bubline story occupies such a large place in any account of the show's controversies, because it was not really about two cartoon characters at all. It was about what a children's cartoon was permitted to say about love in a particular decade across a particular and unevenly accepting world, and the show became, somewhat against its own gentle nature, a participant in one of the defining cultural arguments of its era. It handled that role carefully, sometimes frustratingly carefully for the fans who wanted the truth stated sooner, constrained by markets and standards and the genuine legal realities of global broadcast. But it got there in the end. And the getting there, the long road from deniable subtext to a kiss that some of the world was still not allowed to see, is one of the more meaningful stories the show ever told, even though most of it happened in the spaces between the episodes rather than inside them. Not all of the show's controversies came from networks or creators. Some came from the audience itself, from the passionate and sprawling fandom that grew up around the show. And these fan-level controversies, while they harmed no one and settled nothing, were a real part of the show's life and worth recounting calmly. The most persistent of them concerned romance, the question of who should end up with whom, the debates that fans call shipping wars. Adventure Time gave its fans a great deal to argue about on this front, and they argued with the intensity that only devoted fans can muster, dividing into camps, defending their preferred pairings, and treating the romantic futures of cartoon characters as matters of genuine importance. Finn's romantic life was a particular flashpoint. Over the course of the show, he had relationships and crushes, most notably a significant relationship with Flame Princess, and his entanglements generated endless discussion about who he should be with, whether particular relationships were healthy, whether the show was handling his romantic growth well or badly. Some fans were deeply invested in particular outcomes, and felt let down when the show went another way. The relationship between Bubblegum and Marceline, once it became undeniable, generated its own fervent following. Fans who had read the subtext for years and felt vindicated, alongside others who had been hoping for different pairings entirely. None of this was a controversy in the serious sense. It was the ordinary, intense, sometimes heated business of a fandom caring too much, which is itself a kind of tribute to how real the characters felt. The show's ending generated its own divided reactions, as endings almost always do for beloved long-running series. The finale was, for many, a triumph, a moving and fitting conclusion that paid off years of emotional investment. But for others, it carried the disappointments that finales of this kind tend to carry. The sense that some threads were rushed, that certain characters or questions did not get the resolution fans had hoped for. That wrapping up so vast and sprawling a world in its allotted time meant leaving some things compressed or unaddressed. This, too, is less a controversy than the inevitable friction of ending something people love. The impossibility of satisfying every hope that years of devotion had generated, The way any conclusion to a cherished story becomes a kind of referendum that not everyone votes the same way on. There were quieter fan debates as well, about the show's direction over time, about whether it had gotten better or worse across its run, about whether the shift toward serialized lore and deeper emotional storytelling in the later seasons was an improvement on the looser, sillier early episodes, or a departure from what had made the show special in the first place. Some fans treasured the early season's anarchic comedy and felt the show grew too heavy and too plotted as it went on. Others felt the opposite, that the show only became truly great once it deepened, and that the early episodes, fun as they were merely the warm-up for the richer material to come. These are the ordinary disagreements of a long-lived show, the natural divergence of an audience large enough to want different things. And they played out across forums and comment sections for the show's entire life and beyond. What is notable, stepping back, is how civil and small these fan controversies were by the standards of modern fandom. Adventure Time inspired devotion, and devotion inspires argument. But the show never became the center of the kind of toxic, organized, genuinely ugly fan conflict that has consumed some other franchises. Its controversies, even among its most passionate fans, tended to stay within the bounds of ordinary disagreement. The shipping debates and the ending opinions and the better or worse arguments that any beloved show generates. The fandom's intensity was real, but its disputes were mostly affectionate, the squabbles of people who loved the same thing and wanted slightly different things from it, which is, in the end, a healthier kind of controversy than most, and a reflection of the gentle spirit of the show that inspired it. It is worth pausing to make a distinction that clarifies all of this. The distinction between a controversy and a scandal, because Adventure Time generated plenty of the former and almost none of the latter. A scandal involves wrongdoing, a genuine transgression that damages reputations and demands accountability. A controversy is simply a matter of public disagreement, a thing about which reasonable people argued. And nearly everything we have discussed tonight falls firmly into the second category. The Bubline censorship was a controversy, a disagreement about what could be shown, not a scandal of anyone's misconduct. The debate about the show's appropriateness was a controversy, a genuine difference of opinion about audience and content. Even Ward's departure was not a scandal, but a quiet personal decision honestly explained. Adventure Time was a contested show, but it was not a disgraced one, and that distinction matters. This is, in its way, remarkable, because the show ran for the better part of a decade, employed a huge crew, became a global phenomenon, and ventured repeatedly into mature and sensitive territory. And it emerged from all of that with its reputation not merely intact, but enhanced. It was contested without ever being disgraced. It pushed boundaries without ever crossing into genuine misconduct. The disputes it generated were the honorable kind, the kind that come from a work of art taking real risks and engaging real subjects, the kind that reflect well on a show rather than poorly. To be argued about for depicting love honestly, for treating dark themes seriously, for being too rich and mature for its time slot, is to be argued about for one's virtues. And most of Adventure Time's controversies were, at bottom, controversies about its virtues. This sets it apart from many shows that attract the word controversy, the ones whose disputes involve genuine offense, real harm, actual transgression. Adventure Time's controversies were almost entirely about whether it was too good for its circumstances, too honest, too dark, too willing to depict a kind of love that some markets forbade. These are the disputes of a show ahead of its moment, not behind its morals. And there is something fitting in that, for a show so concerned with gentleness and decency that even its controversies should turn out, on inspection, to be largely to its credit the friction generated by a kind and honest work pressing against the limits of what its era was ready to allow. That is not to say the show was perfect or beyond all criticism. No work that runs for a decade and employs hundreds of people is without its missteps, its episodes that did not land, its choices that some found wanting, its moments that aged less well than others. Like any long-running series, it had its weaker stretches and its debatable decisions. And honest criticism of these is part of taking the show seriously. But missteps and debatable choices are the ordinary texture of any large creative work, not scandals. And the show's genuine flaws were the forgivable kind, the inevitable imperfections of an ambitious project, rather than the marks of any real wrongdoing. The honest verdict is that Adventure Time was a remarkably clean show for its size and ambition. Contested often, disgraced never. Why does this matter for an account of its controversies? Because it reframes the whole subject. To go looking for the controversies of Adventure Time expecting scandal is to come away surprised by how little dirt there is to find. The show's controversies are not embarrassments to be uncovered, but disputes to be understood, windows into the era it was made in, the standards it pushed against, the changes it was part of. They tell you less about any failing of the show and more about the world the show existed in, a world still arguing about what children should see, still unevenly accepting of certain kinds of love, still adjusting to a form of animation that had outgrown its old assumptions. The controversies of Adventure Time are, in the end, a portrait of a moment, and the show comes through that portrait looking, if anything, better than the moment around it. The clearest proof that the show's controversies were controversies of virtue rather than vice is the recognition it received even as it was being argued, over and edited, and occasionally banned. While certain markets were cutting its content and certain parents were questioning its appropriateness, the show was simultaneously becoming one of the most decorated animated series of its time. Over its run, Adventure Time earned a long list of major awards, including multiple Primetime Emmy Awards and a prestigious Peabody Award, along with Annie Awards and international honors and a steady stream of critical acclaim. The same show that was too suggestive for some broadcasters and too dark for some parents was, at the very same time, being honored by the industry's most respected institutions as some of the finest work animation had to offer. This is the central paradox of the show's reception, that it was contested and celebrated in the same breath, edited in one country and given awards in another, questioned by some parents and praised by critics as a landmark. And the paradox is not a contradiction. It is exactly what happens when a work is genuinely ahead of its moment, doing something new and difficult and not yet universally accepted. The acclaim and the controversy came from the same source. The show's willingness to be more than a children's cartoon was supposed to be, and depending on who was looking, that willingness read either as a triumph deserving of every honor, or as a transgression requiring an edit. The show did not change. The eyes looking at it differed, and the gap between those eyes is the whole story. The acclaim matters for our purposes because it provides the context that the controversies alone would distort. To hear only about the censorship and the bans and the parental complaints might leave the impression of an embattled or disreputable show, a program forever in trouble. The truth is the opposite. Adventure Time was, by the standards of its industry, a critical darling, a multiple award winner, a show held up as evidence of how good the medium could be. The controversies were real, but they were the minor turbulence around a craft that was, by near universal critical agreement, exceptional. The full picture is not a troubled show, but a celebrated one that happened to push against a few boundaries on its way to being celebrated. And that distinction is essential to understanding what its controversies actually amounted to. It is worth remembering, too, that the controversies and the acclaim were often about the very same qualities. The show was praised for its emotional depth and questioned for its darkness, and these were the same thing. It was celebrated for its honest representation and censored for that representation, and again, the same thing. It was admired for treating its young audience as capable of handling complexity and worried over for exactly that treatment. The list of the show's controversial qualities and the list of its award-winning qualities are on inspection nearly identical, which tells you that the controversies were not a separate dark side of the show, but simply the resistance its virtues encountered. The friction generated by excellence pressing against the expectations of its form and its era. And in the long view, the verdict is clear, because the acclaim endured and the controversies faded. The edits and the bans are now historical footnotes, curiosities of a particular moment, while the show's reputation as one of the great animated series has only solidified with time. The kiss that some countries cut is now remembered as a landmark. The darkness that some parents feared is now cited as the show's glory. The representation that was once too hot for television is now seen as having helped change television for the better. Time has been kind to the show and unkind to its controversies, sorting the lasting value from the temporary friction. And what remains is a series remembered for its courage and its heart rather than for the disputes it occasioned along the way. The controversies were real while they lasted. The achievement is what lasted. It is worth looking more closely at the specific qualities that drew concern, because the darkness that worried some broadcasters and parents was not vague. It was concrete, and it appeared in identifiable forms throughout the show. The most striking was the show's treatment of mental decline, embodied in the Ice King. Here was a character played for laughs in a children's cartoon, whose underlying story was a man losing his mind and his memory and his very self to a magical affliction across 1,000 years. A portrait of something very close to dementia rendered with real and unsettling accuracy. For viewers who understood what they were watching, the Ice King's plight was genuinely disturbing. a serious depiction of cognitive loss hidden inside comic relief. And it is easy to understand why some found it heavy material for the youngest members of the audience, even as others praised it as one of the most honest depictions of such loss ever attempted in the form. The show's treatment of death was similarly frank. Characters died, death itself was a recurring presence, a literal character, and the boundary between living and dead was crossed and recrossed in ways that treated mortality as a real and serious subject rather than a thing to be kept safely off screen. Episodes touched on grief, on loss, on the end of things, with a directness uncommon in programming for children, and while much of this was handled with care and even beauty, it was undeniably more than the genre had traditionally offered, and it contributed to the sense among the show's more cautious viewers that this was strong material for a young audience. The horror elements pushed further still, with genuinely frightening imagery surrounding figures like the Lich, the embodiment of death and extinction, whose appearances carried real menace and unsettling visuals that some markets, as we have seen, judged too intense for regular broadcast. Beyond death and madness, the show engaged in its cartoonish and often deniable way, with a range of mature subjects that organizations advising parents specifically noted. Characterizations of the show have pointed to its handling of difficult topics, including the suggestion of substance use and intoxication, rendered through metaphor and innuendo, and its treatment of sexuality, again largely through implication and subtext rather than anything explicit. None of this was graphic, and most of it was pitched to pass over the heads of young viewers while registering with older ones the show's characteristic double address, but it was present, and it was part of what made the show's content a matter of genuine discussion, the steady accumulation of mature themes handled lightly enough to air and seriously enough to matter. What unites all of these elements is that the show consistently chose to engage with the hard realities of existence rather than to shield its audience from them. And this was a deliberate philosophy rather than an accident. The creators clearly believed that young viewers could handle, and indeed would benefit from, honest engagement with death and loss and the difficult textures of being alive, delivered in a form that was safe and contained and surrounded by warmth. This was the conviction that generated both the acclaim and the concern, the belief that a children's show could and should treat its audience as capable of more than the genre usually assumed. Whether that belief was right was precisely what the appropriateness debate was about, and it is a debate with reasonable voices on both sides, between those who feel children should be protected from heavy material and those who feel that honest, careful engagement with difficult truths in a safe context is one of the most valuable things art can offer the young. The show itself seemed to land firmly on the side of honest engagement, and its defenders have made the case powerfully over the years. Children, they argue, encounter death and loss and difficulty in their real lives regardless of what their television shields them from, and a show that addresses these things with care and beauty and warmth gives young viewers a way to begin processing them, a set of emotional tools delivered in a form they can absorb. On this view, the show's darkness was not a danger but a gift, a rare willingness to be honest with children about the things that matter most, and the concern about its content reflected an underestimation of what children can handle, and a misunderstanding of what art for the young is actually for. This is a serious argument, and it has largely won the longer cultural debate, as the boundary pushing the show was once questioned for has become increasingly accepted as the medium has matured. There is a larger phenomenon worth contemplating in all of this regional editing, which is the strange fact that a single show, in the age of global distribution, becomes many slightly different shows depending on where it plays. The Adventure Time that aired in the United States was not in every detail the Adventure Time that aired in the United Kingdom, which was not the version that aired in Australia, which was not the version permitted in the countries that cut the finale kiss, which was not in the end available at all in the country that banned it outright. Each market received a version filtered through its own standards, its own anxieties, its own laws, so that the show existed not as one fixed object, but as a family of related versions, each one shaped by the particular fears of the place that aired it. This is not unique to Adventure Time, of course. It is the ordinary condition of globally distributed media, the quiet reality that what you watched depended on where you watched it. But Adventure Time, because it pressed so consistently against the edges of acceptability, became an unusually clear example of the phenomenon, a show whose international editing history reads almost like a survey of the world's varying values. What one country cut and another kept, what one softened and another banned, forms a kind of accidental map of cultural difference, a record of where the lines fell in different places, what was tolerable here and forbidden there. The show became, without intending to, a measuring instrument, its edits revealing the contours of a world that does not agree with itself about what children should see, or what kinds of love may be shown. And there is something poignant in the thought of all those slightly different versions, all those audiences receiving subtly altered renderings of the same beloved story, most of them never knowing what had been changed. The child in one country who never saw the kiss did not know it had been removed. The version they received was simply the show, complete as far as they knew. The viewers who got the instrumental version of a song never heard the words that had been there. The absence was invisible to them. The editing was, by design, seamless. The cuts smoothed over so that each regional version felt whole, which means that millions of people grew up with an Adventure Time subtly different from the one its creators made and from the ones their counterparts in other countries received, each believing they had seen the real thing. The show was one thing in the minds of its makers and 100 slightly different things in the experience of its global audience. And the gaps between those versions are a quiet record of the world's disagreements, written in the language of what got cut. The internet complicated and illuminated all of this, because for the first time, audiences could compare. Fans in different countries could discover what had been changed in their version by comparing notes with fans elsewhere, could learn that the kiss they never saw had aired uncut across the ocean, could assemble, collectively, the full map of the show's regional editing. This is part of why the censorship of Adventure Time is so well documented, because a connected global fandom did the documenting, comparing versions, cataloging cuts, exposing the differences that the editing had been designed to hide. The same connectivity that let the show reach the whole world also let the world's audiences compare their versions and notice the seams, turning what would once have been invisible local edits into a visible, discussed, collectively understood phenomenon. The censorship could no longer happen in the dark because the audience had become a single connected body capable of seeing all the versions at once. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. This connected fandom played a role in the representation story too, because the same fans who compared censored versions also advocated, discussed, and celebrated, building the conversation around the show's queer subtext into something the creators and the network could not ignore. The audience was not passive. It read the subtext, discussed it, championed it, and made its desire for honest representation known. And that collective pressure was part of the long road toward the finale's confirmation. The controversy around Bubline was not only a top-down story of networks restricting content, it was also a bottom-up story of an audience pushing for it, reading the implications generously, refusing to let the relationship be erased, and ultimately helping to create the cultural conditions in which it could finally be shown. The fans were participants in the controversy, not just observers of it, and their advocacy is part of why the story ended the way it did. Step back far enough and the controversies of Adventure Time resolve into a single larger story, the story of animation growing up. For most of its history, animation aimed at young audiences operated under a set of assumptions so deep they were rarely even articulated. That cartoons were simple, that they were disposable, that they should shield children from difficulty, that they were a lesser form not meant to carry real weight. Adventure Time was part of a generation of shows that began gently and then decisively to break those assumptions, to insist that animation could be art, that it could carry genuine emotional and philosophical weight, that it could treat its young audience as capable of depth. And whenever a medium breaks its old assumptions, it generates exactly the kind of friction Adventure Time generated. The controversies that come from doing something the form was not previously allowed to do. In this light, the appropriateness debate was not really about Adventure Time at all. It was about whether the old rules of children's animation still applied. And the show happened to be one of the places that question got argued. The parents who worried it was too dark and the critics who praised its maturity were really debating the same underlying question: what animation for young people was now permitted to be. And the show was the occasion rather than the true subject. It was caught in the turbulence of a medium in transition. And the discomfort it caused was the discomfort of an old order giving way to a new one, the unsettled feeling that accompanies any real change in what is considered possible or acceptable. The transition the show was part of has, by now, largely completed, which is why its controversies feel so dated in retrospect. The idea that animation can be serious, emotionally complex, willing to engage death and identity and love is no longer controversial. It is simply understood, the new normal that shows like Adventure Time helped to establish. The boundary pushing that once generated debate has become the standard against which new work is measured. And so the show occupies a particular historical position, one of the works that did the difficult early labor of expanding the form, that took the friction and the controversy and the edits so that the shows after it could do similar things without the same resistance. It was, in a sense, a pioneer, and pioneers always meet more resistance than those who follow the trail they cut. This is the deeper meaning of the censorship in the bans and the parental concern, that they were the resistance a pioneer meets, the friction generated by a work doing something genuinely new in a genuinely conservative form. Every edit, every refused episode, every worried review was a small instance of the old order pushing back against the new thing the show was doing. And the fact that the show pushed forward anyway, that it kept being dark and honest and willing to depict difficult love, is part of why the medium is where it is now. The controversies were the cost of the contribution, the price the show paid for helping to drag animation toward a fuller maturity, and that price now looks entirely worth paying, the temporary friction that accompanied a permanent advance. There is a useful principle hidden in all of this, which is that you can often measure the significance of a work by the controversy it generates, because only work that matters, that does something real, that pushes against something, generates controversy at all. Truly inconsequential work is never controversial. There is nothing in it to argue about. The fact that Adventure Time was edited and banned and debated is, paradoxically, evidence of its importance, proof that it was doing something with enough force to provoke a reaction. A show that no one ever found too dark or too suggestive or too mature would have been a show that was not really attempting anything. And the controversies, far from being marks against the show, are among the clearest evidence that it was a work of genuine consequence, significant enough that the world felt compelled to argue about it. You do not censor what does not matter. The censorship is, in its backhanded way, a tribute. It is worth dwelling, with appropriate care, on why the representation controversy mattered so much to so many people, beyond the abstract question of what a cartoon may depict. For a great many viewers, especially young ones who were themselves beginning to understand that they did not fit the narrow templates television usually offered, seeing a relationship like Bubblegum and Marceline's treated as real and worthy and central was not a small thing. Representation in media, particularly media aimed at the young, carries a weight that is hard to overstate because it tells viewers something about whether people like them exist, whether their experiences are speakable, whether the kind of love they may feel is the kind of love a story can be about. For viewers who had rarely or never seen themselves in the cartoons of their childhood, the slow arrival of honest representation in a show they already loved was genuinely meaningful, and the controversy around it was, for them, a controversy about whether they got to exist on screen at all. This is why the years of deniable subtext, frustrating as they were to many fans, were not nothing even before the finale. Even in implication, even unconfirmed, the relationship gave certain viewers something to recognize. A sense that the show saw them, that their kind of love was present in the world of Ooh, even if it could not yet be named. And it is why the eventual confirmation, the kiss in the finale, landed with such force in the places it was allowed to air. It was not merely a plot resolution. It was a statement, after years of careful ambiguity, that this love was real and would be shown, a moment of recognition for an audience that had waited a long time to be recognized. The controversy was real because the stakes were real, because what was being argued over was, for some viewers, a question about their own visibility and worth. And the show's careful, constrained, ultimately successful navigation of this left a legacy that outlasted the controversy itself. By pushing as far as it could within its constraints, by reading its audience correctly, by getting to the confirmation in the end, Adventure Time helped to widen the space in which later shows could operate. The resistance it met and pushed through was resistance that later works would meet less of, because the ground had been broken. The spin-off that followed, centered on Fiona and Cake and written openly for the grown audience that had come of age with the original, could be far more direct about such things precisely because the original had done the difficult early work, had taken the edits and the bans and the debates so that its successor could simply tell the truth without the same fight. The legacy of the representation controversy was a freer medium, and that legacy is, in the long run, far more significant than any individual edit. The arc from constraint to freedom, traced across the original show and into its spin-off, is in miniature the arc of the whole medium during these years. The movement from a form that could only imply toward a form that could finally state. And Adventure Time sits at a crucial point on that arc, late enough to push meaningfully against the old constraints, early enough that it still had to fight them, constrained enough that its progress had to be careful and partial, brave enough that it made the progress anyway. It is a transitional work in the best sense, a show caught between an old order and a new one, and helping, through its careful courage, to move the medium from the first toward the second. The controversies it generated were the documented friction of that movement, and the freedom that followed was its result. None of this means the work is finished, and the international cuts are the permanent reminder of that. Even now, the same content that is celebrated in some places remains forbidden in others, and the map of where a cartoon's depiction of love is permitted remains divided. The controversy did not end in a clean global victory, and it would be a false comfort to pretend otherwise. What the show achieved, it achieved unevenly, more fully in some parts of the world than others, and the honest account acknowledges both the genuine progress and its real limits. But within those limits, the show did something that mattered, took a real risk for a real reason, and helped, in its gentle and constrained way, to make the world of children's media a little more honest about the full range of human love than it had been before. That was worth the controversy, and the controversy was, in the end, a measure of how much it was worth. It helps to lay the whole saga out in order, because seen as a chronology, the controversies of Adventure Time tell a single coherent story that spans nearly the show's entire life. It begins in 2010 when the show premieres into a landscape of children's animation still operating under the old assumptions. By the third season, with the episode that first planted the bubline subtext, the show has begun, quietly, to test a boundary, and the early skirmish over the removed recap shows the network's discomfort with how clearly the subtext was being read. For the next several years, the relationship lives in deliberate ambiguity, while the show steadily accumulates its other points of friction. The content edits across various countries, the episodes deemed too dark for certain markets, the ongoing background debate about whether the whole show was suitable for the audience it appeared to target. The year 2014 is a pivotal one in this chronology, because two significant things happen close together. Olivia Olson publicly reveals that the creator confirmed the Bubblegum and Marceline relationship privately, clarifying both that it was real and that the show could not state it because of where it aired. And in the same period, it emerges that Pendleton Ward has quietly stepped down as showrunner due to burnout, the show's behind-the-scenes turning point becoming public. 2014, in other words, is the year the show's two largest controversies, the representation question and the creator's departure, both came into the open, a hinge point in the show's public life. The chronology then moves toward its difficult and triumphant climax. In 2017, the show is banned outright in Kenya over its perceived content, the most absolute act of rejection in its history. And in 2018, the finale arrives with the kiss that confirms, at last, what the show had implied for 7 years. A moment of resolution that is immediately complicated by the international cuts that remove it in the markets where such a depiction remains forbidden. The single year of 2018 thus contains both the show's greatest representational triumph and the starkest demonstration of its limits. The kiss celebrated and censored at the same moment, the arc reaching its peak and meeting its boundary simultaneously. And the chronology does not quite end with the original series, because the story continues into the show's afterlife. In the years that follow, freed from the constraints of the original's network and time slot, later projects in the franchise are able to depict the Bubblegum and Marceline relationship openly and centrally, building entire stories around the love that the original could only confirm in its final seconds. A special centered on the two characters explores their relationship with a frankness the original was never permitted, and the later spin-off, written for grown audiences, continues this freedom. The chronology, then, is an arc from silence to speech, from a relationship that could not be named in 2011 to one that could anchor whole stories a decade later, the show and its successors traveling in real time. The distance the culture itself traveled. Laid out this way, the controversies stop looking like a scattered list of unrelated disputes and start looking like a single sustained narrative. The story of a show pushing, year after year, against the limits of what it was allowed to be, meeting resistance, pushing anyway, and slowly, partially, unevenly winning more room. The content edits, the dark themes debate, the creator's burnout, the representation saga, the ban, the kiss, the afterlife, all of it is one story, the story of a gentle show that turned out to be quietly insistent, that kept testing boundaries with a soft persistence, and that helped, across nearly a decade, to move the lines of its medium. The controversies were the milestones of that long, quiet push, and the chronology of them is, in the end, the chronology of the show's courage. There is a gentle irony at the center of all this that is worth resting in, which is that Adventure Time, of all shows, became contested. This is a series whose defining qualities are softness, kindness, warmth, a show that millions of people use quite literally to fall asleep, a show whose whole sensibility is gentle. And yet this gentlest of shows turned out to be quietly one of the more contested cartoons of its era, edited and banned and debated across the world. The softness and the contestation seem like they should not belong to the same show, and the fact that they do reveals something important, that gentleness and courage are not opposites, that a work can be soft in its manner and bold in its substance, that the quietest voice can say the most contested things In fact, the gentleness may have been part of what allowed the boldness. Because the show was so soft, so warm, so clearly made with love, it could venture into difficult territory that a harsher show could not. Its gentleness was a kind of permission, disarming the resistance that more aggressive content would have provoked, letting the show address death and madness and forbidden love precisely because it did so with such tenderness. The controversies happened despite the gentleness, but the gentleness is also part of why the show could generate those controversies and largely survive them. Why it could push boundaries and remain beloved. Why it could be edited in some places and celebrated in others, rather than simply rejected everywhere. The softness was not the opposite of the courage. It was the vehicle for it. And from the calm distance of now, years after most of these controversies have faded, there is something peaceful in looking back on them. The way there is something peaceful in looking back on any old storm from safe shores. The disputes that once felt urgent, the edits that once provoked anger, the debates that once divided fans, have mostly settled into history, their heat dissipated, their stakes resolved or rendered moot by the passage of time. The show endures. The controversies have become footnotes. And looking back on them now is not an agitating experience, but a contemplative one. A chance to understand a moment in the history of a medium and a culture, to see how far things have come, to appreciate the courage it took and the resistance it met, and the way it all, mostly, worked out. This is, in the end, the gift of distance, that it turns the heat of controversy into the calm of history. What felt like a battle while it was happening becomes, in retrospect, simply a chapter in a story, comprehensible, settled, understood. The people arguing on either side of the appropriateness debate were, most of them, acting in good faith, genuinely concerned for children or genuinely convinced of the show's value. And from a distance, you can see the reasonableness on both sides, the way each was responding to something real. The censors in distant countries were operating within laws and standards not of their own individual making. The fans pushing for representation were pursuing something that mattered to them. Even the disputes themselves, seen from far enough away, soften into a kind of understanding. The recognition that this is simply how a culture works through a change, through argument and friction, and the slow movement of the lines, until what was once contested becomes settled, and a new generation cannot quite believe it was ever in question. So you can let these controversies rest gently in your mind the way you let any piece of settled history rest. There is no urgency to them anymore. No battle still to be fought tonight. The kiss aired and was cut and is remembered. The show was edited and banned and beloved and endures. The creator stepped back and the show went on and reached its beautiful end. The debates were had and the medium changed and the difficult work of expanding what a cartoon could be was done. All of it is finished now, settled into the past, and what remains is simply the show itself, gentle as ever, and the quiet history of how it pushed, softly and persistently against the limits of its time, and helped, in its tender way, to move them. There is a deeper harmony worth noticing between the show's controversies and the show's values, because the things Adventure Time got into trouble for were almost exactly the things Adventure Time was about. The show preached gently and consistently a set of values: tolerance, honesty, the acceptance of difference, the importance of love in all its forms, the courage to face difficult truths rather than hide from them. And its controversies were, almost without exception, about depicting precisely those values. It was contested for showing a kind of love some found unacceptable, which is to say, for practicing the acceptance it preached. It was debated for facing death and difficulty honestly, which is to say, for practicing the honesty it preached. The controversies were not a betrayal of the show's values. They were the show living them, paying the real-world cost of putting its convictions on screen. This is a rare and admirable kind of consistency, the alignment of a work's message and its risks. Plenty of art preaches values it does not embody, advocates courage safely, champions difference without ever risking anything to do so. Adventure Time put its values where its risks were. When it taught acceptance, it accepted on screen the relationships and identities that acceptance implies, and took the controversy that followed. When it taught honesty about hard things, it was honest about hard things, and took the concern that followed. The show's controversies are, in this light, a kind of integrity test that the show passed, evidence that it actually meant what it said. That its gentle preaching of love and honesty was backed by a willingness to depict love and honesty even when doing so is contested. A show that preached tolerance and then quietly avoided ever depicting anything that would test that tolerance would have been a hypocrite. Adventure Time was not a hypocrite. It paid for its values, and the controversies were the receipt. And there is something to be said about the audience's role in this, about what it means to be the kind of viewer who argues about a show like this. To care enough about a cartoon to debate its representation, to advocate for its characters, to argue about whether it is appropriate, is to take the show seriously, to treat it as something that matters. And the intensity of the controversies is, in its way, a measure of how much the show was loved. People do not argue passionately about things they are indifferent to. The whole contested life of Adventure Time, the debates and the advocacy and the disputes, is evidence of an audience that cared deeply, that refused to treat the show as disposable, that engaged with it as something worth fighting over. The controversies were, among other things, a form of love, the love of an audience invested enough to argue. There is even a kind of privilege embedded in much of this, the privilege of being able to argue about a cartoon at all, to debate whether a children's show is too dark, to dispute the romantic futures of animated characters, to compare which scenes were cut in which country. These are, in a sense, the luxuries of an audience secure enough to invest its passions in fiction. And there is nothing wrong with that. It is one of the pleasures of a culture, the ability to care intensely about stories. But it is worth remembering, especially regarding the representation controversy, that for some viewers the stakes were not merely the pleasures of fandom, but something more personal, a question of whether they got to see themselves, and that for them the argument was not a luxury but a matter of recognition and dignity. The same controversy could be, for one viewer, an entertaining debate about a cartoon, and for another, a question about their own visibility in the world, and both were real, and the show held both at once. In the end, the controversies of Adventure Time are best understood not as a catalog of troubles, but as a record of a show that mattered, that took risks, that meant what it said, and that engaged an audience deeply enough to be argued over. They are the friction of significance, the resistance that meets any work doing something real, the cost of integrity and the measure of impact. A show with no controversies would have been a show that risked nothing and meant little. Adventure Time risked things, meant things, and was argued over accordingly. And its controversies, examined honestly, turn out to be among the better things that can be said about it. The evidence that it was a work of consequence, made with conviction, in a moment that was not always ready for it. Underneath the specific edits and bans lies a genuine and difficult question that deserves to be taken seriously, rather than dismissed. The question of what we owe children when it comes to difficult truths. The impulse to protect children, to shield them from death and darkness and complexity, is not a foolish or malicious one. It comes from love, from the deep and natural desire to preserve the innocence of the young, to let childhood be a protected time before the hard realities of the world arrive. The broadcasters who edited the show, the parents who worried about it, were not, for the most part, acting from bad motives. They were acting from the protective instinct, the wish to keep difficult things away from young minds. And that instinct is ancient and understandable, and not to be sneered at. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. But there is an opposing wisdom, equally serious, which holds that shielding children from difficult truths does not actually protect them, only leaves them unprepared, and that the kinder course is to help them encounter such truths gently in safe and loving contexts, before they have to face them alone in the harsh world. Children, after all, experience loss. They lose pets, grandparents, sometimes worse. They feel fear and confusion and grief, whether or not their television acknowledges these things. And a show that addresses such experiences with care, that gives young viewers images and stories through which to understand what they are feeling, may be offering them something more valuable than protection, offering them company and understanding in the sense that their difficult feelings are speakable and shared. On this view, the darkness of Adventure Time was not a danger to children, but a gift to them, a rare honesty in a landscape of shows that mostly pretended the hard things did not exist. The disagreement between these two wisdoms, the protective and the preparatory, is real and probably permanent, because both contain truth. There are difficult things genuinely too much for the very young, from which protection is right and good. And there are difficult things that children are already facing, about which honesty serves them better than silence. The hard part is knowing which is which, where to draw the line, and reasonable, loving people draw it in different places. The controversy over Adventure Time's appropriateness was, at its best, an instance of this serious disagreement. Two forms of care for children, the protective and the preparatory, meeting over a particular show and arguing about where the line should fall. Seen this way, even the censorship, even the parental concern, came from a place not so different from the show's own deep care for its young audience. Everyone involved, in their way, was trying to do right by children. They simply disagreed about what doing right meant. And the show itself seemed to understand this tension, because it was, in its content, constantly negotiating it. Adventure Time did not simply dump darkness on children. It wrapped its darkness in warmth, surrounded its difficult truths with safety, delivered its hard material in a context of love and comfort and gentle humor. It was, in its own way, trying to thread the needle, to be honest with children about difficult things, while keeping them safe in the encounter, to prepare without traumatizing, to tell the truth tenderly. The show was itself an attempt at the very balance the controversy was arguing about, an effort to find the place between protection and honesty where difficult truths could be shared with the young in a way that helped, rather than harmed. Whether it always found that place is debatable, but the attempt was serious and thoughtful, and the show's darkness was never careless or gratuitous, but always, evidently, trying to serve its young viewers rather than merely disturb them. This is perhaps why the show, for all the concern it generated, was ultimately embraced even by many who had worried about it, because its care was so evident. Parents who sat down to watch it with their children, expecting to find it inappropriate, often found instead that its difficult moments were handled with such tenderness, such evident love for the audience, that they came to trust it. The darkness, encountered directly rather than feared from a distance, revealed itself as gentle, purposeful, kind. And the conversations the show prompted between parents and children, about death, about loss, about difference, about love, turned out to be among the things parents came to value most about it. The way it gave families a gentle occasion to talk about the things that are hardest to talk about. The very content that generated the controversy became for many families the content they were most grateful for. The honest, tender, difficult material that gave them a way to begin the conversations that childhood eventually requires. For all the ways the show was divided across borders, edited and cut and banned differently in different places, the most remarkable fact about its global life is how universally it was loved. The same show that was contested in so many markets was also embraced in nearly all of them, becoming a genuine worldwide phenomenon, beloved by children and adults across cultures and languages and continents. The edits and the bans, real as they were, affected the margins of the show's content. They did not diminish the central fact that people everywhere connected with it, that its themes of friendship and adventure and growing up translated across every border, that a cartoon born in one country became a shared touchstone for a generation around the world. The controversies were local and various. The love was global and shared. There is something quietly beautiful in that, in the thought of children in dozens of countries watching slightly different versions of the same show, edited to slightly different standards, and yet all falling in love with the same boy and his dog, the same candy princess, the same vampire queen. The differences were real but superficial. The connection was real and deep. Whatever got cut, what remained was enough to reach hearts across the world, and the show became one of those rare cultural objects that belongs to no single country, but to a whole global generation. A shared childhood spanning languages and borders, a common reference for people who would never meet, but who had all, in their own slightly edited versions, grown up in the same land of ooh. This global embrace puts the controversies in their proper proportion. They were real, and they mattered, and they deserved to be understood. But they were the friction at the edges of a phenomenon that was at its core about connection, about a show that brought an enormous and diverse global audience together around the same stories and the same feelings. The censorship divided the show into many versions. The love united its audience into one. And in the long run, it is the love that has proven more powerful, the shared affection that has outlasted the local edits, the global community of people who grew up with the show and carry it with them in whatever version they happen to receive. The controversies fragmented the broadcast. They never fragmented the love. And in a sense, the show's deepest values won the largest victory precisely through this global embrace. Because a show preaching tolerance and friendship and the acceptance of difference became itself a point of connection across the very differences it celebrated. People of different cultures, different languages, different values about what children should see, all found something to love in the same gentle show, and that shared love is itself a small enactment of the show's message. A demonstration that despite all our differences and disagreements and varying lines about what is acceptable, we can still be moved by the same stories, still recognize the same truths about friendship and loss and growing up, still meet across all our divisions in the common ground of a good story honestly told. The show that was edited differently in every country united its audience in the end. And that unification, across all the differences that the edits represented, is perhaps the show's quietest and most fitting triumph. So the controversies and the global love are finally two sides of the same coin, the friction and the connection generated by the same qualities. The show was honest, and its honesty was contested in some places and embraced in others. It was gentle, and its gentleness disarmed resistance and won hearts across borders. It was brave, and its bravery met edits in some markets and adoration in most. The very qualities that generated the controversies were the qualities that generated the love, and in the end the love was larger, the connection deeper, the embrace wider than the disputes. The controversies are a real and interesting part of the show's history, but they are a small part, the turbulence around a phenomenon that was overwhelmingly about bringing a global generation together around a story made with honesty and gentleness and love. Let us gather the documented moments together now, gently, the way you would lay out old photographs before putting them away. There was the episode in the third season called What Was Missing, where the show first planted the quiet suggestion of a love between the Candy Princess and the Vampire Queen, and the recap, posted to an associated channel that was reportedly removed, the first small skirmish in a long, quiet war. There was the year 2014, when the voice of Marceline revealed publicly that the relationship was real, confirmed privately by the creator, unsayable on screen because of where the show was allowed to play. There was the same year's quieter revelation that the show's creator had stepped back from running it, worn down not by the imagining but by the managing, and that another hand, a classmate from art school, had taken up the work. There was the episode called Ghost Princess, set aside in one country for its hints of death and the supernatural, judged too dark to air in the ordinary run. There was the line about popping a head like a cork, softened in one broadcast into the chirping of a bird. There was the cheerful song with the violent lyric, reduced to a wordless melody so the image it carried would not be heard. There was the small physical gag, censored across several countries, and the blunt line of dialogue, quietly cut. There was the year 2017, when an entire nation removed the show from its airwaves over the nature of its content. And there was the 3rd of September, 2018, the finale and the kiss, celebrated in much of the world and edited out of the rest, the same few seconds of animation that were a triumph in one place and an absence in another. These are the documented controversies, the real and verified record of the friction the show generated across its life. And laid out together, they have a strange gentleness to them. None of them a true scandal, all of them the honorable disputes of a show doing something real. They are not the marks of a troubled program, but the milestones of a brave one, the record of a gentle show pressing year after year against the limits of what it was allowed to be. And there is a peace in reviewing them now from the safe distance of after, knowing how it all turned out, knowing that the show endured and was honored and is beloved, knowing that the kiss is remembered as a landmark and the darkness as a glory, and the whole contested life of the show as evidence of its consequence. For all that we have explored, the honest final word is that Adventure Time was a remarkably uncontroversial show for one so significant that the worst that can be said of it is that it was sometimes too honest, too dark, too tender about forbidden things for some of its markets, that its controversies were controversies of virtue, and that it emerged from all of them with its reputation enhanced rather than damaged. To go looking for its scandals is to find, instead, a record of its courage. And to study its controversies is to come away admiring it more, not less, understanding better what it risked and what it meant, and how much it mattered. The controversies are, in the end, a tribute, the friction that only significant and brave work generates, the resistance that confirms a thing was doing something real. And so there is nothing here to trouble your sleep, only a quiet history to rest in. The story of a gentle show that was sometimes argued over because it was sometimes braver than its moment, that pushed softly against the limits of its time, and helped, in its tender way, to move them, and that came through all of it, every edit in every band and every debate, beloved across the world and honored by its peers and remembered, rightly, not for the disputes it occasioned, but for the heart it showed in occasioning them. The controversies were real. The courage behind them was realer, and the love that outlasted both is the realest thing of all. There is one more area of quiet contention worth touching, and it concerns how the show ended, the discussions that surrounded its conclusion after 10 seasons. When it became known that the series would be drawing to a close, the reaction among its devoted audience was, predictably, mixed with sorrow, and with it came the questions that always attend the ending of a beloved long-running show. Was it ending naturally, having told its story, or was it ending sooner than it might have? Had it reached its proper conclusion, or was it being wrapped up before its time? These questions are rarely answerable with certainty from the outside, where the reasons behind such decisions are tangled up in network strategy, creative exhaustion, ratings, and the simple reality that all shows eventually end. But they were asked, and the asking was its own small controversy, the inevitable grief and second-guessing that surrounds the close of something people have loved for years. For a show that ran as long as Adventure Time did, and that had already weathered the departure of its creator from the showrunner role, and the long maturation of its themes, ending after 10 seasons could be read either as a natural and dignified conclusion or as the premature close of a world that still had more to give. Both readings had their advocates. Some felt the show had told its story, reached its theme's fullest expression, and earned a graceful ending rather than a slow decline into diminishing returns. Others felt the Land of Ooo was inexhaustible, that there were endless more stories to tell in it, and that ending the show meant closing a door on a world that could have gone on delighting audiences for years more. The debate was, in the end, a measure of love, the reluctance of an audience to let go of something precious, the wish that it could simply continue forever. And in a way, the show's own afterlife answered the debate because the world did continue, just in different forms. The ending of the original series was not the ending of Ooo. New specials explored corners of the world the series had not had time for. A new spin-off carried beloved characters into fresh stories for a grown audience. The franchise persisted, expanded, found new life beyond its supposed conclusion, which suggests that the original series ended not because the world was exhausted, but because that particular telling of it had run its natural course, leaving room for new tellings to follow. The conclusion of the main series was a conclusion, not an extinction, and the continued life of the franchise afterward is the quiet rebuttal to any fear that the ending meant the world was gone for good. This pattern of an ending that turns out not to be an ending is deeply fitting for Adventure Time specifically, because the show itself was so preoccupied with exactly this idea, with cycles, with continuations, with the way nothing in Ooo truly ends, but only changes form. A show obsessed with the notion that endings are also beginnings, that the wheel keeps turning, that something always grows back, ended its own run, and then fittingly kept growing back, in specials and spin-offs and the enduring devotion of its audience. The controversy over whether it ended too soon dissolved, in time, into the recognition that it had not really ended at all, that it had simply changed the way the show always insisted everything does, passing from one form into another without ever fully disappearing. So even the controversy of the show's ending resolves, like all the others, into something gentle and characteristic, a dispute that time and the show's own afterlife quietly settled. The audience grieved the ending, debated whether it came too soon, and then watched the world continue in new forms, learning, as the show had always taught, that the thing they loved was not gone, but transformed, that the ending was a kind of beginning, that the Land of Ooo, like everything in it, simply changed shape rather than ceasing to be. And that lesson, learned through the experience of losing and then not quite losing the show, was perhaps the last gift the original series gave its audience, a final demonstration of its deepest theme, taught not through an episode, but through the very experience of saying goodbye to it. There is a way of reading censorship that turns it into an unintentional confession, because what a society chooses to cut from its children's media reveals more clearly than almost anything else what that society fears. Run back through the edits the show received around the world, and they form a kind of inventory of anxieties. The cutting of a kiss between two women reveals an anxiety about which kinds of love may be acknowledged. The softening of violent lines and images reveals an anxiety about exposing children to aggression. The setting aside of an episode for its themes of death reveals an anxiety about mortality, about letting the young contemplate the end. Each edit is a small window into a fear, and the global map of the show's censorship is, read this way, a map of the things the various cultures of the world were most anxious to keep from their children. And there is something illuminating in that, because the things a culture most wants to protect children from are often the things that culture is itself least at peace with. A society fully comfortable with same-sex love would have no impulse to cut the kiss. The cutting reveals a discomfort that belongs to the adults, not the children. A culture at peace with mortality would not need to shield the young from a cartoon's gentle treatment of death. The shielding reveals the adult's own unease. The censorship of children's media is, in this sense, less about children than about the censors, a projection of adult anxieties onto the young, a way of managing the things the grown world has not made its own peace with by keeping them away from the next generation. What we cut for our children is a confession of what we ourselves cannot yet calmly face. Adventure Time, by pressing against so many of these anxieties at once, became an unusually rich instrument for revealing them. And the record of its censorship is therefore a kind of cultural document, a portrait of the fears of its moment. The fact that the kiss was the single most cut element tells you something about which anxiety was most acute in that decade, across the most cultures. The pattern of the edits taken together sketches the contours of what the early 21st century world was most uneasy about, rendered legible by a gentle cartoon's collision with dozens of different standards. The show did not set out to be a measuring instrument for cultural anxiety. but its long-contested global life made it one, and the measurements it took are preserved in the record of what got cut where. And the show's own response to all of this anxiety was, characteristically, gentleness rather than confrontation. It did not rage against the censors or denounce the markets that cut it. It simply kept being what it was, kept telling its honest, tender stories, kept pushing softly forward, and let the edits happen where they had to, while reaching, with whatever room it was given, toward more honesty rather than less. There is a kind of patience in that, a refusal to be embittered by the resistance it met, a steady, gentle insistence on its own values that wore down the resistance over time more effectively than anger would have. The show met the world's anxieties not with a fight but with a kind of warm persistence, and that persistence, more than any confrontation, is what slowly moved the line. This is, finally, the most characteristic thing about the controversies of Adventure Time, that they were met on the show's side with the same gentleness that defined everything else about it. A different show might have made its controversies into battles, into public denunciations and angry statements and confrontations with its censors. Adventure Time mostly just kept being gentle and honest and brave, and let the controversies be what they were, and trusted that its quiet persistence would, in time, do more than any loud fight could. And it was right. The gentle persistence won. Slowly, unevenly, but it won, moving the medium and the culture by patient example rather than by force, which is, when you think about it, exactly how the show itself always taught that real change happens, not through power but through the steady, patient, gentle insistence of love on being itself, no matter how much resistance it meets. So let us gather the whole of it together now, gently, as the night deepens. We set out to catalog the controversies of Adventure Time, expecting perhaps a list of troubles, and we found instead a single coherent story. The story of a gentle show that was braver than its moment and met, accordingly, with resistance. We found the long saga of two characters whose love could only be implied for years and finally shown at the end, celebrated in much of the world, and cut from the rest. We found a global pattern of edits and bans, a cartoon adjusted region by region to fit dozens of different fears, one show fractured into many. We found a debate about whether a show so dark and honest belonged on a children's network, a debate that was really about whether animation itself was allowed to grow up. We found a creator who stepped back from the weight of his own success, and a transition handled with such care that the show only deepened. And we found, in the fandom, the ordinary affectionate disputes of an audience that cared too much to be indifferent. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. And running through all of it, we found the same thread, the thread that is the show's own deepest theme, the gap between a gentle surface and a serious depth. The controversies of Adventure Time were, every one of them, controversies about that gap, about a show that looked soft and was underneath, doing difficult and honest and contested things. The candy surface drew in an audience and disarmed resistance. The serious depth generated the friction, and the controversies were simply the places where the depth showed through the surface clearly enough that the world had to respond to it, with an edit, a ban, a debate, a worried review. They were the visible signs of the show being more than it appeared, the friction of its hidden seriousness meeting the expectations its surface created. This is why the controversies, far from diminishing the show, ultimately honor it. A show that generated no controversy would have been a show whose surface was the whole of it, with no depth showing through, nothing serious enough underneath to provoke a response. The controversies are the proof that there was depth, that the candy sat on something real, that the gentle show was quietly attempting things significant enough to be argued over. To study the controversies is to map the places where the show's hidden seriousness broke the surface, and the map is extensive, which tells you how much seriousness there was underneath, how consistently the show was doing more than it appeared, how much real weight was hidden beneath the bright and soft exterior. And the resolution of nearly every controversy points in the same direction, toward the vindication of the show's gentle courage. The representation it was contested for became a celebrated landmark. The darkness it was questioned for became its acknowledged glory. The boundaries it was edited for pushing became the new normal it had helped establish. The creator's quiet departure became a model of a graceful transition. The ending that was mourned became a beginning as the world continued in new forms. Time, the great settler of controversies, found in favor of the show on nearly every count, sorting the temporary friction from the lasting value and leaving the show standing taller for the disputes it had weathered. The controversies were real while they lasted, and the show was right in the end, about nearly all of them. That is the deepest verdict a study of its controversies can reach, that Adventure Time was, in its quiet way, on the right side of its own disputes, that its gentle insistence on honesty and love and the depiction of difficult truth was the position that time would vindicate, and that the resistance it met was the resistance that brave and decent work meets on its way to being recognized as brave and decent. The controversies were the cost of being ahead of the moment, and the show paid that cost with characteristic gentleness, and the moment in time caught up, and the show was waiting there, having been right all along, gentle and brave and honest. On the far side of disputes, it had quietly won by simply refusing to be anything other than itself. There is a gentle way to hold all of this as you drift towards sleep. And it is the way the show itself would probably want you to hold it. Not as a tally of grievances or a list of villains, but as a story understood with compassion for everyone in it. The censors and the worried parents and the cautious executives were not, for the most part, bad people. They were people acting from care and constraint, doing what they believed was right, or what their circumstances required. The fans who argued and advocated and grieved were people who loved something deeply. The creators who pushed and the markets that resisted were caught together in a moment of cultural change that none of them fully controlled. To understand the controversies with compassion is to see them not as a battle between the good and the wicked, but as the ordinary, complicated, mostly well-meaning way that a culture works through a change. Everyone doing their best from where they stood, the lines slowly moving as they did. This compassionate understanding is, in a sense, the most Adventure Time way to hold the show's own controversies, because compassion for everyone, even the ones who get it wrong, even the ones on the other side, was always one of the show's deepest values. The show that humanized its villains, that found the wound beneath every cruelty, that insisted almost no one was beyond understanding, would surely extend the same generosity to the human beings involved in its own disputes, the ones who cut its content and the ones who fought for it alike. And there is peace in adopting that view, in releasing any lingering urge to be angry about old edits or old debates, in seeing the whole contested history of the show with the same gentle understanding the show extended to everything else. The controversies become held this way not a source of agitation, but an occasion for the very compassion the show was always trying to teach. And really, at this hour, there is nothing to be agitated about at all. The disputes are over, the lines have mostly moved, the show is beloved, the kiss is celebrated, the darkness is honored. The medium has grown up. Whatever battles were fought over Adventure Time were fought and, mostly, won. And what remains is simply the show, gentle and deep and brave, and the quiet history of how it came to be the thing it is. You can let all of it settle now, the edits and the bans and the debates, into the calm of resolved history, a story with a happy enough ending, a gentle show that pushed against its moment and helped to move it and came through beloved. There is no urgency left in any of it, only the soft satisfaction of understanding how a good thing made its way through a complicated world. Let the controversies then become just another part of the show's long, gentle story, no more troubling than any other chapter. A record of courage met with resistance, and resistance overcome by patience. Of a soft show that turned out to be quietly strong. Of a candy surface that hid a serious heart, and was sometimes argued over when the heart showed through. It is, in the end, a story to be at peace with, even fond of, the way you become fond of the difficulties a loved thing overcame on its way to becoming itself. The controversies are part of how Adventure Time became Adventure Time, part of the texture of its remarkable life, and understanding them only deepens the affection, only adds to the sense of a show that mattered, that risked, that meant what it said, and that came through everything, still gentle, still honest, still loved. It is worth considering what became of all these edits in the age of streaming, because the move from broadcast to streaming changed the landscape of censorship in ways that matter to the story. When a show airs on broadcast television, it is edited for each market and time slot, and the edited version is, for most viewers, the only version they will ever see. But when a show moves to streaming, the situation shifts. Often, the original uncut versions become available, the edits of the broadcast era falling away as the show finds a new home with different standards. For many viewers, streaming meant access for the first time to the show as it was actually made, the cuts of their childhood broadcasts replaced by the complete episodes. The censorship of the broadcast era became, in this way, a historical artifact, a record of how the show used to be presented rather than how it would be presented going forward. This created an interesting situation, in which the same content that had been cut from a viewer's childhood broadcast could later be watched, uncut, on a streaming service. The forbidden material now freely available to the same audience that had once been shielded from it. The kiss that some countries cut from the broadcast finale could, in many places, eventually be seen in the streaming version. The edits had been real, but they were not, in the end, permanent. And the move to streaming meant that the true version of the show, the one its creators made, became increasingly the version that endured, while the patchwork of regional broadcast edits faded into the past. The censorship had shaped how a generation first encountered the show, but it did not get the last word on what the show actually was. The press and the critics played their own role throughout all of this, and it is worth acknowledging, because the controversies were in part constituted by the coverage of them. It was journalists and critics who reported Ward stepping down, who interviewed the cast and surfaced the revelations about the characters' relationship, who documented the edits and the bans, who debated the show's appropriateness in reviews and essays. The controversies existed not only as events but as subjects of discussion, and that discussion, in the press and among critics and across the growing world of online commentary, was part of how the controversies took shape and meaning. A controversy is, after all, partly a matter of public conversation, and the conversation around Adventure Time, serious and sustained and largely thoughtful, was itself part of the phenomenon. This coverage was, on the whole, sympathetic to the show, which is part of why the controversies never became genuinely damaging. The critical and journalistic consensus tended to side with the show's honesty and ambition, to frame the censorship as the problem rather than the content, to celebrate the representation rather than question it, to admire the darkness rather than fear it. The press, by and large, was on the show's side, and that mattered, because it meant the public conversation around the controversies was mostly a conversation about the show's virtues, reinforcing rather than undermining its reputation. The controversies were discussed, but they were discussed in terms that flattered the show, and that sympathetic coverage is part of why the show emerged from its contested life with its standing enhanced. It helps, too, to place the show in the context of its era, because Adventure Time was not the only animated series pushing against the old boundaries during these years. It was part of a broader wave, a generation of shows that together expanded what animation aimed at young audiences could do, and could depict, and the controversies it faced were versions of controversies that this whole wave of shows faced in their own ways. The pushing against content standards, the questions about appropriateness, the slow fights over representation, these were happening across the medium, not only on this one show, and Adventure Time's controversies are best understood as its particular share of a transformation that was reshaping animation as a whole. It was one soldier in a larger advance, and its specific battles were instances of a war the whole medium was quietly fighting. Understanding why networks edit at all is part of understanding the controversies fairly, because the censorship was rarely about individual malice and usually about institutional reality. Networks operate within markets, answer to advertisers, must satisfy regulators, and distribute their content across territories with wildly different laws and standards. An edit made for one market is often less an expression of anyone's personal values than a calculation about what that market's regulations and norms require, a business and legal decision rather than a moral crusade. This does not make the edits painless, especially for the viewers they affected. But it does complicate any simple story of villainous censors, replacing it with the messier reality of institutions navigating a fragmented global landscape of rules. The cutting of the kiss in certain countries was, in many cases, a matter of those countries' laws, not the personal choice of any individual. And understanding that is part of understanding the controversy, honestly. Beneath all of it runs the gap between the show as its creators intended it and the show as it was variously allowed to be. And that gap is, in a sense, the true subject of every censorship controversy. The creators had a vision, a set of stories they wanted to tell, relationships they wanted to depict, truths they wanted to address. And what reached audiences was that vision filtered through layers of constraint, network standards, market regulations, time slot expectations, international laws. The controversies were the friction at the boundary between what the creators wanted to make and what the world would let them show. And the history of the show's contested life is, read one way, the history of that gap, of creators reaching for honesty in a fragmented world, permitting it unevenly. That the creators got as much of their vision through as they did, that the kiss and the darkness and the honesty mostly survived, is a quiet triumph of intent over constraint, of a vision strong enough to mostly prevail against the forces that would have softened it. The influence of how Adventure Time navigated its controversies reached forward into the shows that followed, and this forward influence is part of the controversy's meaning. Because the show pushed against the boundaries and mostly survived, because its representation was ultimately celebrated rather than punished, because its darkness was honored rather than rejected, it made the path easier for the shows that came after. Later animated series could depict difficult things and honest relationships with less resistance, in part because Adventure Time and its peers had already absorbed the first shock of the boundary pushing, had already proven that audiences would embrace such content, had already shifted the expectations of networks and viewers alike. The controversies were not just events in the life of one show, they were part of the slow clearing of a path that later creators would walk more freely. And that forward influence is among the most significant things the controversies accomplished. When you ask, then, what every Adventure Time controversy really amounts to, the honest answer is something like this. It amounts to the record of a gentle, ambitious, honest show doing difficult things in a form and an era not entirely ready for them, meeting the resistance that such work meets, and mostly prevailing. It amounts to a story with no real villains, only people navigating change from different positions, some pushing forward and some holding back, all caught in the same cultural current. It amounts to a set of disputes that time has largely settled in the show's favor, leaving its reputation enhanced and its courage vindicated. And it amounts, finally, to a kind of honor, the honor of having mattered enough, risked enough, meant enough, to be argued over it all. The way the controversies are remembered now tells its own story. They are recalled, when they are recalled, mostly with a kind of fondness, as the growing pains of a beloved show, the obstacles it overcame on its way to being treasured. The censorship is remembered as a curiosity, the edits as artifacts of a less accepting time, the debates as questions that have largely answered themselves. There is little lingering bitterness, little sense of unresolved grievance, because the show won its arguments and the culture moved and the disputes lost their heat. What remains is a gentle historical awareness, the knowledge that the show was once contested, held alongside the recognition that the contesting was, in the end, on the wrong side of where things landed, and that the show was on the right side, patiently, all along. In this way, Adventure Time becomes a small case study in how cultural change actually happens, which is rarely through sudden revolution, and usually through patient, contested, uneven advance. A boundary is pushed, resistance forms, the pushing continues, the resistance slowly gives. What was once forbidden becomes, in time, accepted, and a later generation cannot quite believe it was ever in question. This is the pattern of most real change, and the contested life of Adventure Time is one small, gentle, well-documented instance of it, a single show pressing against the limits of its moment and helping, through patience rather than force, to move them, until what it was once edited for became the new ordinary it had helped to make. And there is something hopeful in that pattern, something worth resting on, because it suggests that gentle persistence really can move even stubborn things that the patient insistence on honesty and decency maintained over years against real resistance really does tend to win in the end. The controversies of Adventure Time are, read this way, a small piece of evidence for optimism, proof that a kind and honest work, refusing to be anything other than itself, can outlast the forces that oppose it and help to leave the world a little more open than it found it. That is not a troubling lesson. It is a comforting one, the reassurance that the gentle and the honest and the brave, given time and patience, tend to prevail even against the fears and the laws and the standards that stand against them at the start. So the full accounting of the controversies ends not in grievance but in a kind of quiet gladness. The gladness of seeing how it all worked out, how a gentle show weathered its disputes and emerged beloved, how the resistance it met gave way and the values it championed prevailed, how the patient courage of a candy-colored cartoon helped, in its small way, to make its medium and its moment a little kinder and more honest than they had been. That is the story the controversies tell, when they are gathered together and understood with compassion and distance. And it is a good story, a gentle story, a story that does the opposite of troubling the sleep. It settles it. It is worth saying, too, that the very fact we can spend a long, quiet evening like this, one calmly recounting a show's controversies, without anger, without stakes, drifting towards sleep, is itself a small testament to how gently those controversies have aged. Some controversies cannot be told this way. Some carry real harm, real grievance, real hurt that resists the calm of retrospect. The controversies of Adventure Time are not like that. They can be laid out softly, understood with compassion, held without agitation precisely because they were, at bottom, the honorable disputes of a decent show. And honorable disputes settle into peace far more easily than genuine wrongs ever do. The peacefulness of this telling is, in its way, the final verdict on the controversies themselves. And there is a quiet pleasure in having spent the night this way, walking through the contested history of a thing you love, understanding it more fully, seeing how the pieces fit, coming to appreciate not only the show but the journey it took through a complicated world. To know the controversies is to know the show more completely, to understand not just what it was, but what it cost and what it risked, and how it made its way, and that fuller knowledge is its own gentle reward. The satisfaction of understanding a beloved thing all the way down, including the difficult parts, including the disputes, including the resistance it met and overcame. The show would, I think, be at peace with being remembered this way, controversies and all, because it never pretended the world was simple or that doing the right thing came without cost. It was a show about difficult truths faced gently, about the prices paid for love and honesty, about the friction that meaningful things generate, and its own contested history is simply one more instance of the very thing it always depicted. There is a fittingness in that, a show about the cost of honesty having paid its own costs for being honest. A show about gentle courage having shown gentle courage in its own life, so that the story of its controversies turns out to be of a piece with everything else it ever told. So let the whole gentle history rest now, complete, understood, at peace. The disputes are over, the show is loved, the kiss is remembered, and the courage behind it, and the long, patient road it took. And you, having spent these hours with the contested life of a gentle show, can let all of it settle into the calm of the past, carrying away only a deeper affection for a thing that risked something real and came through beloved. There is nothing left here to trouble you, only a quiet history, gently told, settling now into sleep. And so we come back at the very end to where we began, to the 3rd of September 2018, and to two characters sharing a kiss in the final episode of a show about a boy and his dog. We began the night with that moment, and with the fact that, in much of the world, it never aired. Cut from the broadcast because a kiss between two women was considered too much for children, or was simply illegal. And now, having walked through the whole long history of the show's contested life, we can see that single moment for what it truly was, the culmination of nearly a decade of quiet pushing, the payoff of 7 years of deniable subtext, the small brave triumph that some of the world still was not ready to see. Think about what that kiss represented, held in the light of everything. It was the resolution of the show's longest controversy, the answer to a question fans had asked since the 3rd season. It was a landmark in the history of representation in children's animation, a door that the show had been pushing against for years finally opening. It was the show, at last, getting to say plainly what it had always meant, free in the end, to depict the love it had only been able to imply. And it was, at the very same moment, in the countries that cut it, a confirmation of the limits that still remained, the proof that the progress was real and uneven, celebrated here and forbidden there. A triumph and a boundary in the same few seconds of animation. That doubleness is the whole story of the show's controversies, compressed into one image. A gentle, brave, honest moment, beloved by those allowed to see it and cut from those who were not. A small act of courage that some of the world embraced and some of the world erased. And the fact that the moment exists at all, that the show fought its way, across a decade, to the point where it could show that kiss to anyone, is the measure of everything the controversies were really about. They were about whether this gentle show would be allowed to be honest, allowed to be brave, allowed to depict the full range of love and difficulty that it wanted to depict. And the answer in the end was mostly yes, unevenly yes, hard-won and incomplete but real. And that kiss is the proof of it, the moment the long quiet pushing finally broke through. So let that be the image you carry down into sleep, not the edits or the bans or the debates, but the kiss itself, and what it took to get there, and what it meant. A gentle show, pushing softly against the limits of its time for nearly a decade, meeting resistance and pushing anyway, until at last, in its final hour, it got to show the thing it had always meant. And much of the world got to see it, and it was beautiful, and it mattered. The controversies were the resistance. The kiss was the breakthrough, and the breakthrough in the end was larger than the resistance. The way love in this show was always larger than whatever stood against it. That is the story of every Adventure Time controversy, gathered into one quiet history, and it is a gentle story. Finally, a story of courage and resistance and the slow, patient victory of honesty and love over the fears that oppose them. There is nothing in it to trouble you, only a soft history to rest in. The record of a kind show that was sometimes braver than its moment and helped, in its tender way, to make its moment kinder. The disputes are settled. The kiss is remembered. The show is loved. And you can let all of it go now into the calm of the past and sleep. If you enjoyed this video essay, make sure to subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.